Why do we even come here anymore? Ryan grumbled, dropping his backpack on the floor with a heavy thud as he sank into the living room couch, phone already in hand. Because Dad makes us, his sister Ellie muttered, slouching next to him, earbuds in, and because Mom would feel guilty if we didn't. Their grandfather, Arthur Lane, sat quietly in the worn armchair across from them, watching with eyes that had once burned with fire, now dulled by decades of neglect and silence. His trembling hands rested on the arms of the chair, the same hands that had once gripped rifle steel in jungle wars, drawn maps for escapees under candlelight, and signed treaties behind closed doors no one ever knew about. But none of that mattered now. To them, he was just old Grandpa Arthur, slow, quiet, and out of place in a world of touchscreens and fast food. "Do you guys want something to eat?" he asked gently, voice raspy like dry leaves brushing pavement. "I baked some apple pie earlier. No thanks," Ryan replied without looking up. "We're good." Arthur hesitated. He hadn't baked pie, he hadn't had the energy. But he would have, if they'd said yes. He would have dragged his bones into that kitchen and peeled apples with shaking hands until it was done. He just wanted them to talk to him. See him, maybe later, he said instead, covering the silence. From the hallway, Arthur's son and daughter-in-law were finishing unpacking groceries. "Try to talk to Dad, will you?" Thomas said to the kids, not unkindly. "He's been looking forward to this all week." "Why?" Ellie rolled her eyes. "He barely says anything." Thomas flinched, but said nothing. What could he say? It was true. Arthur had grown quieter over the years, not because he didn't have stories, but because no one had ever asked. Arthur's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the porch. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw the jungles again, the cries, the smoke, the brilliant flashes of light. Then he opened them and returned to his silence. The next day, Arthur watched his grandchildren play on their phones again. His words caught in his throat. "You know," he began, almost whispering, "there was once a time I stood in front of 3 tanks with nothing but a notebook in my pocket." Ryan scoffed. "Sure you did, Grandpa." Arthur chuckled, not bitterly, just quietly. "They were real tanks." "Okay," Ryan muttered, tapping away. "I was 22, Arthur continued, ignoring the skepticism. "The year was 1963. Somewhere in a jungle in Southeast Asia. But we weren't allowed to name the place. Top secret. Our unit was trying to extract a defector, a scientist." Ellie yawned. "This isn't Netflix, Grandpa." Arthur stopped, his lips shut like a trapdoor. He nodded slowly and turned back toward the window. Later that evening, Thomas came in and sat on the couch beside Arthur. "You okay, Dad?" Arthur nodded again. Thomas glanced at his father, at the deeply lined face, the sharp jaw now dulled by time. He'd grown up thinking of Arthur as invincible, the man who never lost his temper, who always knew the answer, who never cried. But now, he saw the loneliness settling on his father like dust on a forgotten shelf. "They'll understand someday," Thomas said softly. "When they're older." Arthur didn't answer. That Sunday, something changed. Back at school, Ellie's history teacher, Mr. Carter, handed out new textbooks, open to Chapter 12, Cold War Covert Operations. Ryan groaned. "Cold War again. Trust me," Mr. Carter said, pacing the classroom with that energy only history teachers seem to have. "This part's different. You're going to read about Operation Cobalt Shadow." A few students perked up. The name sounded cool, dangerous. Ryan flipped open the book lazily until he saw the photo. It was grainy, black and white, but the man in the image was unmistakable. Sharp eyes, square jaw, a faint scar under one eye. "Wait," he whispered, sitting up. "Wait, what the?" Ellie leaned over. "What?" Ryan pointed. Below the photo was a caption, "Lieutenant Arthur Lane, Intelligence Liaison, Operation Cobalt Shadow, 1963. Awarded the Medal of Valor for single-handedly orchestrating a successful extraction and defusing a foreign nuclear threat." "Is that?" Ellie began. "It can't be." They stared at the paragraph. Each word seemed to lift off the page and slam into them like thunder. Ryan flipped ahead. There was more. A section detailing Arthur Lane's post-military work, diplomatic missions, rescue efforts, war crime investigations. His name appeared again and again. Arthur Lane, key witness in the Dresden Files. Arthur Lane, strategic architect of Operation Ember. Arthur Lane, recipient of the Iron Eagle Medal, the only civilian ever awarded it. Why didn't we know this? Ryan whispered. Because we never asked, Ellie said quietly. That night, they begged their parents to visit again. Immediately, Thomas, stunned, agreed. Back at Arthur's house, the knock on the door was urgent. Arthur shuffled over. You just left yesterday. Ryan didn't answer. He hugged him. Arthur stiffened in surprise. Everything all right. We're sorry, Grandpa, Ellie said, eyes brimming. Arthur looked between them. What for? For not knowing, Ryan said. For ignoring you. Arthur blinked. I don't understand. Ellie held up her textbook. We found your name in here, chapter 12. Arthur's lips parted, not in surprise, but as if he'd forgotten that the world still remembered, that someone had written it down. You read it? He asked softly. Every page, Ryan nodded, every single word. They sat with him that night, phones off, attention full. They asked about the jungles, the tanks, the defector. They asked about the scar under his eye. They asked about the little girl he'd carried through a burning village to safety. She survived, Arthur whispered. She sent me a card every Christmas until she was 30. They listened to how he'd once used a chessboard to transmit codes, how he'd tricked enemy agents into evacuating their own headquarters, how he'd saved not just people, but futures. And you never told us any of this, Ellie asked, voice thick. You never asked, Arthur said with a sad smile. And I never wanted to sound like I was bragging. Ryan laughed bitterly. You weren't bragging. You were being a hero. From then on, the visits changed every weekend. Ryan brought more questions. Ellie recorded interviews. Arthur's stories became the heartbeat of the house. Then one day, the principal of their school called. Is there any chance your grandfather would speak to our students? She asked. His legacy is remarkable. Arthur hesitated at first. Public speaking. He hadn't done that in decades. But when Ryan looked at him and said, You'd be helping more kids than you'll ever know, Arthur nodded. The auditorium was packed. When he walked up to the microphone, his hands trembled again, but when he spoke, the fire returned. Every word landed like an echo from history. He ended with this, Your stories may not make textbooks, but if you carry yourselves with courage, humility, and honor, someone will remember, even if it's just your grandchildren. The crowd rose, thunderous applause. Later, as the family walked home, Ellie slipped her hand into her grandfather's. I'm sorry it took a textbook for us to see you. Arthur smiled gently. I'm just glad you finally did. Arthur's life transformed in the quiet months that followed, not through grand parades or medals, but in the everyday resurrection of respect. For the first time in years, his voice was no longer met with polite nods or indifferent stares. Now, when he spoke, his grandchildren leaned in like disciples at the feet of a prophet. Tell us about the Dresden Files again, Ellie said one Saturday morning. Recording equipment already set up on the coffee table. Arthur chuckled, sipping his tea. You always go for the dangerous ones. They're the best stories. Ryan grinned. Besides, we read online that you testified against a general who was responsible for war crimes. Arthur's gaze dimmed slightly. I did, but it wasn't about vengeance. It was about the truth. They paused, giving him time. I remember sitting in that courtroom, he continued. The man on trial had caused the deaths of hundreds innocent people, villagers, children. I had intel coordinates, dates. The world called him untouchable. Arthur's voice dropped. But when I gave my testimony, his wife began to cry. Why? Ellie asked. Because she never knew, Arthur whispered. And she had loved a monster. The room fell silent. Did you ever feel scared? Ryan asked after a moment. Arthur gave a dry laugh. Every day. Fear isn't something you overcome. It's something you walk through. Ellie looked at him differently now, not as a frail old man with trembling hands, but as someone who had stood inside the storm and survived It wasn't long before the local news picked up the story, "Forgotten War Hero Lives Among Us." The headline read, "They featured his life in a segment showing old photographs, faded letters, and excerpts from once classified documents, now declassified and digitalized." "Grandpa," Ellie whispered one evening after the piece aired, "you're trending on Twitter." Arthur looked confused. "I'm what?" "Never mind," Ryan said, laughing. "It's a good thing." Soon, Arthur was invited to universities, veterans conferences, and local schools. He spoke with a calm gravity, with humility, always humility. "People think heroism is about glory," he once told a packed hall. "It's not. It's about duty, about doing the right thing even when no one sees it." One evening, while sorting through a box of old papers, Ellie pulled out a crumpled letter. The handwriting was tiny, neat. "To Lieutenant Arthur Lane," it began. "You don't know me, but I owe you my life." She read the rest out loud, tears forming in her eyes. Because of you, I grew up. I became a teacher. I have 3 children. Thank you for what you did in the forest near Santa Village. You didn't know my name, but I knew yours." Arthur wiped his eyes. "I didn't know she survived. She did more than that," Ellie whispered. "She lived. At school." Ryan's teacher pulled him aside. "Your grandfather has inspired a new curriculum. We're adding a section called Unsung Heroes of the Cold War. He'll be the first." Ryan beamed. "He deserves it." The day they gave Arthur the town's honorary medal, he stood awkwardly on stage, the mayor praising his service. "I didn't do any of this for recognition," Arthur said. "I just wanted to come home, and when I did, I wanted to matter." That night, back at the house, Arthur held the medal in his hand, running his thumb over the engraved edge. Ryan and Ellie sat beside him, closer than they'd ever been. "You always mattered," Ryan said. "We just didn't see it." Arthur smiled. "Then I suppose this is a second chance." And it was. More than that, it was a rebirth. He started writing his memoirs, slowly, methodically, with Ellie typing them out and Ryan editing chapters. Chapter 1. Arthur dictated. "The sound of jungle rain is like silence, except it hides everything you need to hear." They laughed at his poetic metaphors, cried at the painful memories, and stayed up late piecing together the mosaic of his past. In time, their family became closer than it had ever been. Arthur's stories weren't just tales, they were bridges, pulling generations together across time and ignorance. The biggest moment came when a prestigious publisher reached out. "We'd like to publish your memoir, Mr. Lane," the woman said on speakerphone. "It's a remarkable account of a forgotten legacy." Arthur's eyes welled up. "I'm not sure anyone will read it, I assure you," she said. "They will." And they did. The book, Walking Through Fear, the Arthur Lane story, became a surprise bestseller. Bookstores held signings. Students wrote essays about him. Even military historians called to ask about long-lost operations. Arthur thought no one remembered. But more important than fame was what happened within his own home. Ryan brought his friends over just to meet Arthur. Ellie organized a veterans podcast and made her grandfather the first guest. Thomas, Arthur's son, admitted one night over dinner, "I used to think you were just quiet, but now I know you were carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken things." Arthur's hands were still shaky. His memory still had holes, but his heart was lighter. He was no longer invisible. One sunny afternoon, they all sat outside on the porch, Arthur in his usual chair, Ellie with a notepad in her lap, Ryan with a video camera rolling. "Final question for today," Ryan said. "If you could speak to every kid who thinks their grandparents are just old and boring, what would you tell them?" Arthur smiled. "I'd say this, look again. Behind the wrinkles, behind the silence, there are stories bigger than you can imagine. Some of us didn't live to tell them, but those who did, we're just waiting for someone to listen." The camera clicked off. Silence followed, but it was a different kind of silence. A full one, a sacred one. In that moment, the wind rustled the leaves like applause, and the sun lingered a little longer on the weathered face of a man who had finally been seen. Arthur Lane, grandfather, veteran, Forgotten hero was forgotten no more. The memoir's release wasn't just a milestone for Arthur, it became a movement. Across town, people began bringing their own grandparents' dusty boxes down from attics, unfolding yellowed photographs and worn medals that had never been explained. Schools organized living legacy days where elders shared stories with students. News outlets labeled it the Arthur effect. But no one felt the change deeper than Arthur himself. One evening, weeks after the book tour ended, Arthur sat alone in his living room, a warm cup of tea in his hand. The walls were now adorned with photos, not just from the past war zones, political ceremonies, humanitarian missions, but recent ones too, Ellie and Ryan interviewing him, Thomas shaking his hand at a signing. Even a photo of Arthur standing beside a massive mural that had been painted on the side of the town library. It depicted Arthur as a younger man, clutching a map, his face intense and noble. At the bottom, in bold letters, read the quote, "Fear isn't something you overcome. It's something you walk through." Arthur reached for a photo of Ryan and Ellie from when they were toddlers. He chuckled softly. "And to think," he whispered, "you two thought I was boring." A knock at the door interrupted his moment. He shuffled over to open it and found a young man standing there, early 20s, wearing a college hoodie and carrying a well-worn copy of Walking Through Fear. "Mr. Lane?" the boy asked nervously. Arthur blinked. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to thank you. Your book changed everything for me. My grandfather never talked about the war, but after I read your story, I asked him, and now he won't stop talking." The boy laughed through watery eyes. "It brought us closer. I didn't even know he had nightmares until last week." Arthur stepped aside. "Come in. You want tea?" The boy hesitated. "Really?" Arthur nodded. "If you've got a story, I've got time." More knocks came over the next few weeks. Students, veterans, young parents who wanted their children to know history as something lived, not just read. Arthur's quiet home was filled with voices again, and for once, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a bridge. Then came the letter, official, sealed with a crest. From the Department of Defense. Arthur opened it slowly. Inside was a formal invitation. The government wished to honor him at Arlington with a special plaque, placed beside a memorial wall for covert operatives who had served in silent valor. They called it the Hall of Shadows. Arthur read it twice, then a third time, for decades. He'd thought his missions would die in files buried in concrete vaults. But now, even the shadows had found light. On the day of the ceremony, the entire family traveled with him. Ryan wore a tie for the first time in years. Ellie clutched a bouquet of white lilies. Thomas and his wife walked beside Arthur, steadying him. The military brass band played softly as they approached the newly unveiled wall. Arthur's name was engraved in steel. Beneath it a simple inscription, Arthur Lane, strategist, peacemaker, witness to truth. A hush fell over the gathered crowd as Arthur stepped forward. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, but all Arthur saw was the wall and the names beside his. Names of men and women he hadn't heard in decades, some of whom never returned. He placed a hand on the cold metal. "Welcome home," he murmured to them. After the ceremony, Ellie slipped her arm around his. "You okay?" Arthur nodded slowly. "I'm grateful." Ryan approached with a framed certificate. "They gave this to you too." Arthur looked at it. Lifetime Service Award. Underneath, a handwritten note from the Secretary of Defense. "Your silence protected us. Your words now teach us." Later that night, as they all sat together in the hotel room, tired, emotional, proud, Arthur cleared his throat. "There's one story I never told," he said softly. Ryan leaned forward. "We're listening." Arthur stared into the middle distance. It was during a winter in Eastern Europe. The mission was to intercept a courier smuggling coded documents. But when I found him, he was just a boy, 15 maybe, shivering, no boots. I couldn't bring myself to hand him over. "What did you do?" Ellie whispered. "I gave him my coat," Arthur said. "Told him to run west and never stop." I changed the report. Said the contact never showed. Did anyone find out? Thomas asked. Arthur shook his head. But I had nightmares for months. Not for what I did, but for what could have happened if I was wrong. You weren't wrong, Ellie said firmly. You saw a child, not an enemy. That's why you're our hero, Arthur smiled through misty eyes. The memoir was later adapted into a short documentary, then a feature film. Arthur never cared much for Hollywood, but he smiled when the actor playing him visited, sat down on his porch, and asked, "How do you want me to tell your story?" "Tell it like I'm nobody," Arthur said. Just a man who did what he had to. And yet, to Ellie, Ryan, and now thousands across the country, he was a nobody. One afternoon, a decade after the rediscovery of Arthur Lane, Ryan, now a teacher himself, stood in front of his history class. He pulled out an old textbook, held together by duct tape and love. "Today," he said, "we're going to talk about someone very important, someone who lived through history, made hard choices, and helped save lives without ever asking for thanks." He flipped to chapter 12, Cold War Covert Operations, Operation Cobalt Shadow. He read aloud the first paragraph. As he did, his students listened with rapt attention, and in his voice was pride, reverence, and a love born from second chances. And when class ended, a young girl stayed behind. "Mr. Lane," she said shyly. "That story, was that your grandfather?" Ryan smiled. Yes, it was." She nodded slowly. "Mine was in Vietnam. He doesn't talk much, but maybe I'll ask him." Ryan's smile deepened. "Please do. You never know what heroes are sitting right across from you back home." Ellie, now a journalist, worked on her second book, The Ones We Almost Forgot, Hidden Legacies of Grandparents. The dedication read simply, "To Grandpa Arthur, who taught me that silence can hold more stories than shouting ever could." Arthur Lane passed away at the age of 95, quietly, with his family beside him and a gentle smile on his lips. They buried him with full honors. Thousands attended the funeral. Veterans, officials, students, readers. A lone bugler played taps as Ellie read a passage from his memoir. In the end, it won't be medals or headlines that define a life. It will be the hands you held, the truth you told, and the stories you left behind for those who loved you enough to ask. And ask they did. Arthur Lane had lived in silence, but he was remembered in thunder. Years passed, but the echo of Arthur Lane's life never faded. In their home, Ellie kept his old armchair just the way he left it, slightly angled toward the window, with a folded plaid blanket over the back and a worn book of poems resting on the side table. Sometimes she'd sit there in the evenings with a cup of tea, just to feel close to him. The world moved fast around her. New wars, new politics, new voices screaming for attention, but here in the quiet, his wisdom lingered. Her second book became a bestseller, sparking a national movement among younger generations to reconnect with their elders. Across the country, social media lit up with the hashtag #AskYourGrandpa and #GrandmaChronicles, filled with stories, photos, and videos of once forgotten family members revealing lives more extraordinary than anyone imagined. Ryan, now a well-loved teacher, incorporated oral history projects into his curriculum. Every story matters, he told his students. Every voice counts. When he brought in one of Arthur's old field maps to show the class, marked with code symbols, drawn under fire, students passed it around like a sacred artifact. One student asked, "Did your grandpa really save a whole village?" "Yes," Ryan replied, smiling, "and not just with weapons, with choices." But the most powerful legacy lay in what Arthur had rekindled within his family. Thomas, Arthur's once distant son, began volunteering at a local veterans center. He helped record memoirs, digitize letters, and sat quietly with men who had gone decades without saying a word. For the first time, he felt connected not just to his father, but to a shared, unspoken brotherhood of sons, learning too late how much their fathers had lived through. One day, While organizing boxes of memorabilia in Ellie's garage, Ryan stumbled across a cassette tape unmarked, dusty, forgotten. Curious. He found an old player, blew out the dust, and clicked play. At first, just static. Then, Arthur's voice, quiet and slow. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm probably gone. That's all right. We all go someday. But I wanted to leave one last story." Ryan's heart stopped. Most people think the hardest thing I ever did was face death. It wasn't. It was facing the mirror afterward, wondering if I'd done enough, if I'd mattered. Not to the world, but to my family, to the ones I'd fought for. The tape crackled, then continued. "I used to sit in that armchair and watch you kids, wondering if you'd ever ask. Then, when you did, that was the day I came alive again. So thank you for seeing me, for letting me be more than just your grandfather, for letting me be Arthur Lane." By the end, Ryan's hands were trembling. He called Ellie. She rushed over. Together, they sat cross-legged on the garage floor, listening to the whole thing twice. Then they copied the audio and uploaded it to the website dedicated to Arthur's legacy. Within a week, it had 2 million plays. Thousands commented, "I just called my grandfather for the first time in years. This made me cry. I never knew my grandma survived Auschwitz." She finally told me after we listened to this together, "We're naming our son Arthur." That fall, a prestigious university inaugurated the Arthur Lane Institute for Oral History and Legacy Studies, a center where students, journalists, and families could preserve stories of the people history had forgotten. The cornerstone was laid with a plaque, "To those who walked through fear and left footprints behind." Ellie gave the opening speech. She wore her grandfather's Medal of Valor pinned beside her press badge. Her voice shook as she began. "Most of us spend our lives thinking heroes wear capes or badges or uniforms, but some wear slippers and sit quietly by the window, waiting for someone to care. My grandfather never asked for fame. He asked only to be remembered." She paused. "And now, he always will be." At home, Ryan tucked his daughter into bed. She was only 7, but already curious beyond her years. "Daddy," she asked, yawning, "was Great-Grandpa really in a movie?" "He was," Ryan said with a soft chuckle. "Sort of. They made a movie about his life." "Wow," she said. "Was he scared all the time?" Ryan answered. "But he did brave things anyway." The little girl considered this, then snuggled deeper into her blanket. "I want to be like him." "You already are," Ryan whispered, kissing her forehead. Downstairs, the fireplace crackled gently. Ellie sat with her laptop, working on her 3rd book, this one a collection of children's stories inspired by real unsung heroes. She titled it, "The Man with the Quiet Eyes." The dedication read, "To every forgotten voice, may someone always ask you to speak." Outside, the wind rustled the trees softly, and somewhere in the quiet night, it felt as though Arthur Lane was listening, proud and smiling, because in the end, he hadn't needed medals. He had something far rarer. He was remembered.